Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Nick Hirschon. I'm a journalism professor here at William Patterson. Thank you for joining us for WPSBJ Reality Check. As always, I'm going to begin tonight with some questions that I have for Lisa, but you're welcome to tweet out questions, hashtag WPSBJ Reality Check. So if you have anything, we're going to put that in the second half of our conversation. As always, we thank Dr. Rob Quick, our chair, for support of the series, and Rod Holliday, Dante Portello, who are producing the show for us in the back tonight, and Olivia is curating the tweets for us, so thank you for that. And that brings me to Lisa. So Lisa is a reporter on the Climate Desk, focusing on climate and environmental policy in Washington for the New York Times. She has covered 8 international climate talks and chased climate-related stories from the bottom of a Chinese coal mine to the top of snow-capped Himalaya mountains. She previously worked for Climate Wire, where she led a team of 12 reporters focused on the business and politics of the changing climate. Before Climate Wire, she was the Washington bureau chief for the Oakland Tribune and later the Los Angeles Daily News. And she and her husband own a pizzeria and a bakery in Washington's Bloomdale neighborhood, so you have a lot going on.
I bring home the health insurance. I do nothing in the pizzeria.
But anyway, please join me in welcoming Lisa again to William Patterson University.
Well, you missed the most important part of my bio, which is that I'm from Wayne, and actually got my start at New Jersey newspapers, at the North Jersey Herald and News.
Oh, wonderful.
So, which I might not have even been in there at this point.
Right. Yeah. Well, because you've had so many accolades since then. But thank you for coming. And since we were texting a little bit about your trip here today, and you were telling me that even as you were on the Port Authority bus coming over to Wayne today, you were working on a story. So just give us a sense of, like, in real time, this was just happening like a half hour ago, you're filing a story and texting your editor. So can you tell us what was going on?
This is not, a bus to New Jersey is not the weirdest place I've ever written a story from, but so these days I'm writing a lot about the 2020 race and climate policy and the way climate change is intersecting with the candidates. So this particular story, which will come out tomorrow, is about Michael Bloomberg, who has given hundreds of millions of dollars to environmental groups and causes and climate change, over the past several years, but yet is sort of meeting a lot of resistance from environmental groups that very much appreciate his money, but are not necessarily, thrilled at his candidacy for various reasons. And so, as is typical, you file a story and then there's a million questions and back and forth with your editor. So on the bus here, the one good thing about this ridiculous traffic that I was in was that I had enough time to send edits back and forth to my editor. So it's not, even at the New York Times, it's not a glamorous job, journalism.
But it shows that you're kind of always on. And then didn't you say this is not the most unusual place you filed a story from? So then what are some of the other crazy, unusual places you filed stories from?
Well, the lead of this is that I'm fine, but I was undergoing chemo last year, and I actually, at one point, did a story while I was getting chemo, which sounds so much more dire than it was. It really, but that, I should have told a different story. That brings the whole thing down.
No, but
I filed stories from the parking lot of a Valero gas station, from waiting rooms. Sort of where, and you have your phone these days, so there's no such thing as being off the clock or, not seeing a note from your editor, or there was a time when we could pretend that I didn't get that email.
Right. Well, I think that's important, again, for them to know, is that even as you're rushing over here and, in the back of a darkened bus, you were trying to do your job. You're still reporting your story. So I think that shows that. But so again, since we're speaking here tonight to college students, I just want to start by asking a few questions about, specifically for them. So I don't know if it was in college for you, high school, a little bit after, but when did you decide to become a journalist? Why was that an intriguing career for you?
So, I'm glad it's a great question, partly because, I think a lot of people like me who work on a specialized beat, a lot of people think you must have studied science or, have a background in environmental, even environmental coverage, which I don't. I got a job at the North Jersey Herald and News when I was 16 years old, mostly because my mother wouldn't let me work at a record store in the Willowbrook Mall. And she wanted me to do something that sounded incredibly boring, like intern for a friend's, father who had a law firm or something horrible like that. And I came from a multi-newspaper family. We always had the Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Herald News in our house, along with Newsweek and whatever else. My dad was always sort of he would always say, that, I don't know if this is true, but he'd always say that, journalists uncover more corruption than police and the FBI, which I like to think is true. I'm not sure. And so I called up the local newspaper and the Herald and News, and I asked if they were hiring, and they said, you could come down. And honestly, I think they hired me because they thought it was cheeky and funny that like a 16-year-old kind of like got herself down to apply for a job, because I didn't know anything. I didn't even know how to properly answer a telephone. And I started writing obits, and I followed reporters around to fires and murders and plane crashes and city council meetings, and I just fell in love with newspapers. And I think, you find a lot of reasons why people go into news, and I wish I could say that I started in news because I wanted to like tell truth to power or even tell great stories, but what the truth is that the thing that first drew me into news was newspapers and the culture of newspapers, and people, when you're, I don't know if you are, you guys all seem pretty cool, but when you're a geeky teenager and suddenly you're surrounded by all these people who know what's going on in the country and the world, and and can talk about it, it was really amazing and eye-opening. And also newspapers are just, people are funny and mean and sarcastic, and and so I entered this really smart, sarcastic, funny world, and realized that there was a whole career available if you're just nosy and ask a lot of questions and then write about it. And so that's really how, what like my origin story in news was. Sorry. No. So from there, I worked at the Herald and News all through high school and a lot of college. For a brief time, I worked at the Village Voice when I was in college, and I pretty quickly decided that I neither enjoyed nor was very good at putting myself into stories. I was much more comfortable and thought it was much more valuable to find out what other people do and say and think, and and relay it to them. And from there, I decided. I started working for the. I got an internship at the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I worked there for a couple of years, and I decided that I wanted to be a police reporter for the rest of my life. I fell in love with, David Simons, who everyone knows now is from The Wire, but at the time had come out with Homicide, the book, which, was amazing, and I loved Edmund Buchanan stories. So I got an editor and publisher yearbook, which is something that just doesn't exist anymore, but was a lovely, I'm so old, was a big book that had all the newspapers in the country and the mastheads and how where you write to them and the circulation levels, and the FBI uniform crime statistics, and I applied to every paper in the country with a huge per capita murder rate and ended up in Bakersfield, California, which was a great place to be a reporter because it's at the top of every list you want to be at the bottom of, and the bottom of every list you want to be at the top of, but a difficult place to be young and college educated and have all your teeth. and I covered crime and City Hall, and I started a police beat. A prison beat, because there was like 11 prisons in the county. And then I came out to Washington for a fellowship. I don't know how far you want, but I mean, the way I got into environment reporting was completely circuitous. I was covering, I got a job covering Washington. I was the Washington bureau chief for the Oakland Tribune, and later the LA Daily News. And I covered, also, there was no one else in the bureau, so it was chief of me. I was covering congressional delegation, everything from, what local lawmakers were doing, saying about the Iraq War at the time, to, how the alternative minimum tax, affects the Simi Valley. And I was climbing the rungs of newspapers, and then they all fell out, and there was all kinds of layoffs, and, the economic bottom fell out of newspapers around 2008. And completely by accident, I landed at a publication called Climate Wire and started covering climate change, and it kind of changed my whole career.
Wow. Well, can you give us a little bit of insight then into your work now at the New York Times in terms of what are the expectations? How many stories are you expected to write in a week? How many other reporters are you coordinating with in coverage? I noticed some of the stories you've been writing recently where you're obviously, since your beat crosses over into politics very frequently, and I wonder kind of how do you manage those boundaries between, are you getting into the person who's covering Bernie Sanders, for example, is that your story when he talks about climate change, or is that their story? But just give us a little bit of insight into, again, what the kind of average day is, for you working at the Times.
Sure. It's a little bit of everything. So I should say about 3 years ago, the New York Times launched a climate change team. And it's the first in the country at a major newspaper that I know of. And it's, structurally, it's interesting because the way the Times works is there's desks, the Metro desk, the national desk, the foreign desk. And the climate team is we're the first subject area desk. So what it means on a practical level is I don't need to compete with the education reporter or the healthcare reporter for the attention of the national editor. But my editor sort of sits at the same level as all these other major desks. And our team is a 15-person team covering the business, politics, and science of climate change. Because I'm based in Washington, my beat is heavily federal policy. These days, I mostly write obituaries for federal climate regulations. I cover the regulatory rollbacks that are happening at a really fast pace in the Trump administration. And then the other offshoot of my beat is the 2020 race. And so a typical day could be anything. So something like today, I was working on the Bernie Sanders story, on the Bloomberg story, and EPA announces that they've come to a settlement with some company for a violation. So it's just a process of talking to my colleagues. Do you think that's a story? Should we do that? Let's hold off on that and roll it into something else. Or I have a partner that I work with who shares this beat with me, the federal policy beat. So we, on any given day, the two of us are talking all the time and kind of figuring out okay, I'm working on a project. Can you handle breaking news if something blows up today, or vice versa?
Okay. One of the interesting things about, I think, covering environment, it's an issue that maybe a lot of people kind of find complicated, hard to understand. How do you distill some of those issues for the average New York Times reader?
I don't think it is complicated. I think especially, climate change, these are stories that affect, or maybe it's the way you look at it. I think these are stories that affect everybody's lives. If we're talking about, whether we're talking about rising sea levels or on average hotter days, or wildfires. These are, you're talking about people and how they live and how their lives are going to change. So that's sort of the first part of what we try to do. When we write about regulatory rollbacks, it does get harder because you're dealing with a lot of like Washington jargon. So I think the trick is to explain as much in really simple terms and to get out of Washington as much as possible. And, so next week, for example, I'm going to Pennsylvania to report on a story about fracking. There's a lot of candidates who, who have called for there's not a lot of candidates. There's three top candidates now who have called for a national ban on fracking. And I'm kind of curious about, and you can write about the politics of that, but I'm kind of curious about what that means in a place like Pennsylvania that Trump won by 44,000 votes, which is like 1%, right? So, can a candidate who, and obviously has a lot of natural gas, is a huge part of Pennsylvania's economy now. So can a candidate who wants to ban fracking win a state like Pennsylvania is kind of what.
When you mentioned covering climate in the age of Trump, there's a lot of climate change deniers out there. I'm sure that a lot of your stories get some feedback from those kinds of folks. How do you handle some of that kind of response that you might be getting, or are you getting those kinds of responses?
Climate deniers are some of my best sources. I mean, there's kind of two parts to that. I mean, when it comes to the science, we're clear and have been clear for many years that, climate change is happening. This is what the scientific consensus is. It is dominantly human caused, and is a serious threat that needs to be addressed. At the same time, the question of what to do about it, or even whether to do something about it, that's a political question, that's an economic question, that's something that, it's our obligation to have all kinds of voices in there. So yes, I hear from people in industry and also people who work for denial groups all the time. And on the one level, I want and need to get their perspective because even if they are not representing the mainstream on the science, their views are now embraced by the administration. So people that we might have considered extremists in a different era, they're now the establishment. They're running large parts of the government, and so it's a detriment to myself and my readers if I don't understand where they're coming from.
Have you faced any sort of negative feedback, especially in, again, this age of fake news accusations? Or we've asked a lot of the reporters who have come speak to us here, just how do you handle that as, you're a human being too, and you're getting these maybe, nasty letters or Twitter comments or whatever. How do you kind of manage that? So
it's happened recently. I did a story on Bernie Sanders that attracted a bit of attention. Other people are really good at engaging on Twitter. It's not my format. I like it, I could use it, but I didn't feel on Twitter, I felt like my story, spoke for itself. People who took the time to email me directly, I'll always engage with. If you send me a nasty email, expect a nice one back. Because, I think people get heated and they dash things. And this always happens, people get heated and they dash things off. And I tend to write something back sort of explaining where I was coming from or, where I think a person is justified in their criticism maybe or not justified. And on balance, people are pretty pleased to hear that there's an actual human being on the other side of the email address. I actually think, like I don't get a ton of Twitter hate. I actually think that like back in the day before the internet, like you got a lot more, like I still have letters like that I've saved for years from like, when I worked for local newspapers of people who would just like tear my stories apart, and they're kind of fun.
Maybe Twitter gives them an outlet to talk in a different way. They feel like their voice is being heard on Twitter, so maybe they don't bring it to you as much.
Yeah, you don't get personal letters that much anymore. I did get one email addressed to me at the New York Slimes. So that was fun.
That's kind of fun. Well, I guess unfortunately, there's a lot of your colleagues who are getting that, so you're in it for everybody else. Well, before we get too late into this, then why don't we try to put up some of the Twitter questions that students have been sending throughout the night, so that we can start seeing what people are saying and make sure we have time to get to them. So we'll just try to make sure we get a few different people in here. Let's see here. So Alan asks, were you drawn to covering climate, or did you just fall into the beat? You addressed this a little bit, but you want to talk a little bit more about, are you drawn to covering climate, or did you fall into it?
I fell into it, and it's the best fall I've ever taken. I mean, and just to, so I landed at Climate Wire, and truly I thought like, well, so Climate Wire is, I don't know if has anyone here heard of E&E News? It's an energy policy publication. It's very Washington centric, but it was amazing. It was, I had never heard of it before I started working there, and truly I thought like, well, maybe I'll be there a year until newspapers get kicked back up, and I really thought like, how long, climate change, how long can a person write about just one topic? And I, almost immediately realized this is the best beat I've ever had in my life, because it is a beat that, yes, is about energy and environment, but it's a beat that is also about migration and immigration and food security and, trade. And for years, so I spent several years covering the international I covered international issues. So my beat was really writing about people on the front lines of climate change. I went to Bangladesh, I went to Nepal, I went to Haiti, and sort of the spine of my beat was covering the international negotiations. Has anyone here heard of the Paris Agreement? Okay, so I covered the Paris Agreement, and then eventually I became editor of Climate Wire, so overseeing the entire publication. And yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of reporters, we fall into our beats and then realize this is amazing. So I was lucky.
Sometimes the beats find us, and there's sometimes where you are very interested, I guess, at a young age, but it's kind of fun that it's kind of chance, right? You just got into that beat, and it's a very, very important thing to be covering right now.
It is. But I think like whatever path you take, I mean, I also know that all of the things that I covered before, when covering immigration for California papers, covering, intellectual property disputes, covering local crime, I mean, all of those things wind up helping you down the road when and if you find a subject area that is the thing that you want to really dig in deep. So.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, let's get some other questions in here. Priscilla asks, has the digital age generated more awareness on climate reporting?
Oh, yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think, just the level of knowledge that people have access to has so dramatically changed. I mean, and I think it's really actually helped climate change coverage. There was a time not that long ago that that papers were losing their environmental beats at a pretty rapid pace, and I think that the rise of social media has actually really helped editors understand that this is an issue that people care about and want to read about. So I'm seeing more environmental and climate coverage than ever before at this point, honestly, and I think it's great.
Yeah. Okay, Sandy's saying, well, let's see, that one got kind of cut off a little bit. but we'll see if we can make a go of it. As a journalist, how do you take the subject of environmental change in politics and make it interesting to readers and to people who still say that climate change and global warming, I guess, doesn't exist?
It doesn't exist, right? Yeah. I mean, I think it's two different things. I mean, the question of how do you make it interesting, I think, is always making sure that you're telling a story about people. Which is not to say that stories about polar bears are not important or interesting, but to me, I think the stories that really resonate are the stories that talk about what climate change means for people living in low-lying areas, people living, in small island nations, people living people who are in areas that are struck by more and bigger wildfires every year. The question of how to convince people, I don't know that that's really my job or, to do. I mean, there's facts and science, and people can, choose to disagree. And I feel like I don't try to, when we cover reports, for example, I think we try to be very even-handed, but it's not, I don't think it's our job to necessarily convince someone. We kind of present the stories and the facts.
Mm-hmm. Is that at all frustrating for you as a journalist? I've wondered this, since the years that I left reporting. In 2011, I left the Daily News as a reporter. And of course, I still have so many friends in the industry. And in this age of the fake news accusations and all of that, and just wondering, are people even reading your work? And, because it just seems like no matter what you write, no matter how much hard work I'm sure you're putting into your stories, some people will just never accept it. So it seems like you've managed to kind of...
So you've met my cousin? And I think that's going to be that way with a lot of subjects, but that's okay. I mean, I also think it is important to reflect the, if not the, sort of incorrect science, but understand the assumptions and sort of worldview of people who don't accept the science. I think that, we actually do ourselves a disservice by not taking time to understand folks that are very skeptical of, of what they're being told by the New York Times, by Al Gore and Leonardo DiCaprio, that feel that, the messengers are flawed, who, and have a lot of thoughts about the science that they're bringing, that they're discussing. It's a balancing act every day, and we try to work with that every day and make sure that we're, sort of reflecting people's views honestly and accurately and generously, while also being accurate to the science.
Sure. Let's see what other people have here. Okay, Leslie asks, the UK government has recently declared a national climate emergency. How do you think this will impact the entire EU and its actions towards decreasing their emissions?
That's a great question. The EU is debating right now whether to reach an agreement on net zero emissions by 2050, which basically means reducing as many emissions as you emit. And while countries like the UK are moving forward at a really progressive rate, in Germany and France, you've also got countries like Poland that, are dependent on coal, and they're really concerned about what targets like these will mean for their economy. So I don't know, but it's a great question. It's an ongoing debate right now at the UN climate conference that's happening in Madrid.
Okay, Okay, well, we'll get Olivia in here, who introduced you. So she says, is climate reporting being met with a deeper skepticism now than it was prior to Trump? And I guess we've been talking a little bit about that, but are you getting that sense that your reporting is being taken, I don't know, in a different way, less seriously, or the readers aren't accepting it?
I mean, honestly, in some ways, the opposite. I think that it's hard to tell exactly, but in some ways, I wonder if there was something of a complacency during the Obama era that, well, this is being dealt with, and now there just seems to be a really electrically charged interest in what's happening and what's not happening. So, I don't feel a huge level of difference in the skepticism toward climate reporting, but I do see a huge new appetite for wanting to know what's being done about climate change, which I think is pretty interesting.
In a similar vein, politically, Jade was asking, now that more people are aware of what's happening with the climate, do you think it has caused politicians to rethink their stances? It sounds like some of your recent reporting about Bloomberg and Sanders, that they are making this a part of their platforms pretty significantly.
Yeah, I mean, so Bloomberg and Sanders have been really, have had worked in big ways on climate change for many years. But you're seeing, I mean, obviously, you guys have heard of the Green New Deal and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I think that that has the sort of force of that has just really helped force Democrats to kind of take a stand on climate change. You're seeing, early in the campaign, politicians who were never really had climate change as one of their issues. Kamala Harris was being hounded. Do you agree with the Green New Deal? And Elizabeth Warren, do you agree with the Green New Deal? So I think it really forced them to take positions maybe even earlier than they were really ready for or comfortable with, because there was such an energy behind the Green New Deal in particular.
I think that we kind of got most of the people in here at least once. I had wanted to just ask you again, for a lot of the students here who are interested maybe in environmental climate reporting, what would you suggest their next steps are, especially in college? Are there certain courses you think they should take? Are there certain skills that you think are important for them to know? It strikes me you do so much international reporting, maybe learning other languages would be an important thing to do. I don't know if you speak other languages, but yeah.
My husband is Turkish, and I speak if I don't have to use verbs, I can speak Turkish. Truly, I really believe that every beat that you have helps you. I work with some brilliant reporters who have spent a lot of years delving into science. I'm not, one of those, but I think, you can't go wrong. There's a million terrific fellowships, science journalism and environmental journalism fellowships that you could check out. But I really think the best thing to do is to get out of your comfort zone and move to a place that you never thought you'd live in, like Bakersfield, California, or Las Vegas, and learn another community and get to know people who don't think like you, and write about their communities. And I know that's not an environmental centric thing at all, but I just think it's like a foundation for any beat that you choose to do.
Mm-hmm. Are there certain minors you think would be useful if someone is, let's say, majoring in journalism, but would it be worth minoring in a certain type of science or political science, or what do you think is useful?
I was an English and Latin American studies major. So, my first editor, I asked him if I should study journalism, and his response was, study anything but journalism. Study basket weaving. Learn something that is interesting to you. Because that also feeds your reporting and helps direct you. So, sure, all of those things, if they're of interest to you, are great, but I think the biggest foundation for reporting is having an interest and a curiosity in a subject matter and pursuing it, and an interest and a curiosity in people and communities and talking to them and finding out what they think.
Just to bring this kind of current, Alan was asking this question about how do you think the future of the Department of Energy will look like under new leadership? And so there's this story coming out about this former lobbyist for the Ford Motor Company. This is your story. You wrote is going to be President Trump's second Secretary of Energy, replacing Rick Perry. So any initial thoughts on what the future is going to be like under him?
I think he's probably going to stay the course. You know, the President Trump has been pretty clear about what his priorities are. You know, and DOE has been really central to this idea that the Trump administration has put out on of energy dominance, which is, you know, both allowing for as much oil and gas drilling and coal development as possible, and where DOE is concerned, promoting exports of U.S. natural gas abroad. And the new Secretary of Energy, Dan Brouillette, has been as big a booster of that idea as Rick Perry. So I think he'll continue down the same path.
Okay. Well, again, as we try to wrap up here with specific advice for them, so we talked about certain things they could major in. Are there certain skills that maybe they wouldn't expect have been very useful for you? There's certain like software programs that you think are important for you to know as climate reporter, or I don't know if there are certain just tools that technology you've used, or anything else. Maybe just it could just be kind of a trick you've learned in your reporting, but something that they could study or kind of acquaint themselves with.
I'm such a Luddite.
Maybe those tools are not as necessary as other reporters in other fields. I'm not sure. That's why I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't do, I mean, I've done data reporting, but it's not my specialty. I mean, I guess what I would offer up is learning how to use FOIA. And learning how to get documents from the government. I think one site that and if you're looking for stories on environmental issues, an easy place to start is to look at other people's FOIAs, and to if I didn't know where to start or what to ask for or what to look for, I would see what other people are looking at. Not every federal agency uses this, but there's a website, FOIA.gov, that EPA and a handful of other federal agencies are on, and you can literally search, what people have requested, and when documents come back, they go to the requester first, but then after 24 hours they go public. So, you can hunt around and see those emails from when. Does anyone here know who Scott Pruitt was? Does that name ring a bell? No. From when the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency was, caught trying to get his wife a franchise at Chick-fil-A, which is a true thing that happened. I think that's probably the most valuable tool that I use as a reporter. I kind of make a list of things that I want to request, and Fridays are my FOIA Fridays, and I send out a bunch of requests. Mm-hmm. Not every Friday, but most.
It's very relevant. We just, in my media law and ethics class, we're talking about FOIA today. And so some students in this forum right now were there last week when we talked about it too. So so it's a very relevant thing. I was telling them all of the different things you can do with federal government, but also local government, even at a state university, what you can find out. So that's really interesting. Okay, so then maybe to wrap up for them, what sort of advice would you have if they're trying to get a start either at the New York Times specifically or just to be a climate reporter? I know you've been giving a lot of advice, but I often frame this in terms of you've probably seen a lot of young people, interns, young reporters start at the New York Times,
right,
make mistakes and or do a very good job. What are some of the traits that you've seen in the people who've been very successful or who haven't been, and how can they kind of learn from that?
Well, so to be fair, I've only been at the Times 2 years, and there's this whole world of reporters who like are just these like, unicorns who get a job at the New York Times when they're like 23 and out of college. And it's possible that I'm going to say this because I'm like bitter that I wasn't a wonderkind and it took me like decades to get to the New York Times. But I think I truly believe that, there is really nothing better than starting at a small newspaper. Newspapers are in a terrible way now. I know that you need to have an exit plan because otherwise you could get, stuck in Bakersfield for good. But, you don't want to make your first mistakes at the New York Times. You don't. You want to make them at the Delano Herald. You want to, and you want the experience of, there is really nothing better than being, 23 years old and realizing like the mayor of this town actually needs to answer your questions, and you're going to look through that budget and, figure out where they're hiding money. And also, what's the deal with this house with all these weird cast iron statues? I'm just going to knock on this guy's door and find out what this is. And, it's a great job. I mean, this is the most fun job there really is, I think. And, there's time to get to the New York Times. I think that there are so many great papers out there. They're struggling and it's difficult, but, but if you're willing to put in, the time to go out in the world, I would really recommend doing that. I think, it's also hard to get a job at the Times. I think that one of the benefits I had was that I had a subject matter that I specialized in, and that's not automatic, right? I mean, that's something that like comes as you learn and cover a beat. So, if you really do want to start at the New York Times, then, yes, I can talk to anyone and help you connect with internship folks there. I don't actually know how it works. I'm that new, but I think it helps if you have something specific that you bring to the table, a subject matter that you really know a lot about, or one that you're really interested in, but truly, I would go to South Dakota first. It's so much more fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming, for all your great advice, for being a former New Jersey girl coming back to speak to all of them today. We really appreciate you making the trek out to William Patterson University.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.